Hello, everybody. I'm back to do the first chapter in The Will to Believe. This chapter is the titular chapter, The Will to Believe. It's not one of the other essays in popular philosophy. It's The Will to Believe. And it's probably one of the most famous James essays of all time. And it's very influential on a lot of people. And it really touches on a lot of different aspects of James's philosophy and his beliefs about religion and his beliefs about psychology. So, yeah, but pretty simply, what it was it was an essay in the justification of faith to say that faith, having faith in something, is a legitimate form of belief, and he was going to argue this at Harvard, the pinnacle or the mecca of secular thinking at the time, and he wanted to show them not only is normal religious faith okay, but what you guys are doing here in the academy is its own kind of faith. So that's what he kind of gets into. But so first, he's got some groundwork to set up, right? So he starts to lay out these different terms. Well, one, he's talking about what is a hypothesis? It's just something that we've proposed to believe. So whenever you're asking a question, is this or is this not true? When someone recommends something to you, these are all hypotheses. And now, if you remember, for James, a belief is something that instantiates itself as a rule for action. So a belief is not just some flippant like, is that flower red or green? It can be something really deep set, like, is it moral for us to pursue this? Is God real? What does God care about? But it can be something as simple scientific, like, how does the law of gravity apply in this situation, that situation? That's normally where people have heard the word hypothesis in science or something like that. But so that's what a hypothesis is it's a proposed belief, and a belief being a rule for action. So there's a couple different axes that he talks about a hypothesis. So a hypothesis can be living or it can be dead. So that means, is this, he calls it like a live wire. Is there actually electricity running through this hypothesis? So I can give you like a ton of different beliefs, like I am wearing a hat on my head. That is a proposed belief. And then I could say of another proposed belief is like my hands are my feet and my feet are my hands. One of those, like, you can potentially consider yourself believing, like there's some validity to it, like it makes sense. You might potentially consider believing it, right? But some are just so distant. So, and he says this is true for most people in religion. So he says Protestantism is a live belief for me, or just a simple belief in the Christian God, or being an agnostic. This is like a thing that he might struggle with, but he just simply does not struggle with the different debates within Islam. He's just, those just aren't even, they don't register to him really. They don't fit in his mind. So none of them are living to him. And then the second axis is an option, forced or avoidable. So this is just this option between two things or between multiple things. Do you have to make a decision right now? So he says something like, are you going to bring an umbrella outside, or are you not going to bring an umbrella when it's raining, let's say? And then he says, this is actually an avoidable question because you can stay inside. You don't need to choose whether or not you can stay in limbo. You can maintain yourself in limbo and not like break the laws of logic. But the question itself, do you want to go outside or do you want to stay inside? That's a forced question. The next axis is something momentous or is it trivial? So is this something that's going to radically change your life if you start believing this, or is it like a trivial thing? So a trivial thing might be like, oh, I need to do laundry maybe today, and I should believe that and live based on that. Or it might be like, I should dedicate my life to like going to the North Pole or something like that. And this would be, there's clearly a significant difference between these things. So then he's laying groundwork here. He says a genuine option is something that is living, forced, and momentous. So there are these occasions in your life where you must make a decision this way or that way. It matters a lot. It's going to change your life. And one of these two options actually might appeal to you in some way. So that's what a genuine option is. But we don't always get to choose things very easily. Can you just coerce your opinions and beliefs? Can you just say, oh, well, that would be nice to believe. I'm just going to believe that, right? So this is a standard critique of pragmatism, where people will hear a caricature of pragmatism where, oh, what is true is what is useful. And then you go, yeah, it would be very useful if nothing was wrong with what I was doing and I could just lay on the couch all day. And he says, but the problem is, you can't, it's very hard to convince yourself that that is an okay thing. You don't get to just pick and choose any belief you want. That's not really how human opinion works. So you see Steven Crowder here. I'm not a big fan of Steven Crowder, but he's got this famous thing called Change My Mind, where he'll put up some opinion or whatever that he holds, and then he'll say, change my mind. And he'll have people come up to him. And if you've seen these videos, you know, it's not about getting his mind changed. It's not about really engaging in debate. It's about causing these little fun videos where you're going to go, oh, catch this crazy feminists yelling at this guy. They just want clips for their videos. It's not really an actual debate about anything. And James references Hume here. He says, we cannot just put things into our mind. We cannot just like willy-nilly, like a buffet, like pick like, well, I like this part of that religion and this part of that religion, but I also like this part of science and that part of science. So I'm just going to add them in my basket and just believe them, right? It's not really, it's not a possibility. So human opinion is not just malleable with whatever we might find convenient, right? So then he starts talking about Pascal's wager. So I'm just going to explain Pascal's wager very simply for those who don't understand it. I've got the basic graph drawn out here. So imagine yourself in a position of uncertainty, right? Either God exists or God does not exist, but we don't know which one is true, right? And then we have an option here. We can either believe in God or we cannot believe in God, right? So if God exists and we believe in him, we go to heaven, right? It's not that simple. I know, I'm not trying to, you know what I mean. If God exists and we believe in him, we go to heaven. But if he exists and we don't believe in him, we go to hell. That's bad. This is good and this is bad, by the way. That's assumed. And then if we believe in God and God does not exist, oh, well, we spent a few hours in church every week and then we can't get those hours back, but, too bad. And then if we don't believe in God and he doesn't exist, then we can gain earthly pleasure. We can do this or that sin and it doesn't matter, and we can have a fun time or whatever. So kind of the way that Pascal sets it up, it's not even this simple. Often this gets caricatured as well, but it's not that simple in actual Pascal. But basically the idea is, since you're uncertain about this, whether or not God exists, you should still believe in God, because the upper row here is preferable to the bottom row, since you're uncertain about this truth. So it's preferable to, oh, maybe we'll lose a few hours in church, risking for heaven, rather than gaining earthly pleasure with the risk of hell. So, but James kind of says this is like an attempt to coerce the will. It's not really, if you present this to someone that's a genuine doubter, they probably won't just go like, oh yeah, okay, so I'll just start believing in God. The belief in God is not something you can just shove into your own head, like for practical reasons. And so he does say that Pascal's wager is a pragmatist style argument, but that it is not a very good one, because it doesn't understand some basic things about how human psychology works. And so, like, for example, if religion has to be a living option for Pascal's wager to work at all. But so he says usually something like this might work as a last ditch attempt. So if somebody is religious and then they find their faith waning and they're like towards the edge of doubt or something like this fear might keep them from taking that final leap over the edge, but it can't get anyone to climb that cliff, really. Or it's not a mechanism that gets them to climb the cliff. They need a helicopter, they need a ladder. There needs to be something else that makes them understand and brings them up towards that there. So I'm gonna read a section here from page 7 of The Will to Believe. And this section is on the disinterestedness of science. So, the talk of believing by our volition seems then, from one point of view, simply silly. From another point of view, it is worse than silly, it is vile. When one turns to the magnificent edifice of the physical sciences and sees how it was reared, what thousands of disinterested moral lives of men lie buried in its mere foundations, what patience and postponement, what choking down of preference, what submission to the icy laws of outer fact are wrought into its very stones and mortar, how absolutely impersonal it stands in its vast augustness, then how besotted and contemptible seems every little sentimentalist who comes blowing his voluntary smoke wreaths and pretending to decide things from out of his private dream. Can we wonder if those bred in the rugged and manly school of science should feel like spewing such subjectivism out of their mouths? The whole system of loyalties which grow up in the schools of science go dead against its toleration, so that it is only natural that those who have caught the scientific fever should pass over to the opposite extreme, and write sometimes as if the incorruptibly truthful intellect ought positively to prefer bitterness and unacceptableness to the heart in its cup. So he's talking about people who have this kind of autoimmune reaction to faith because they're so enamored with the patience of science over many, many years and the purported disinterestedness of science. So sometimes we reach these points with hypotheses in science where you go, well, it could be this or it could be that. And then they say, well, wait, don't make a choice yet, or don't let what you want to be true lead you to an answer, right? They say, just wait, be objective. Don't add any of your subjective things into it. And he's saying that, so there's a real reason why people admire science and its purported disinterestedness to as opposed to faith. And so people that say, oh, well, you can just believe things because you think them to be true, or you think it's a good thing to believe, then these people seem to be ruining the fun of science and the augustness and the sincerity and the patience and the almost, these are like the scientific virtues. Don't be too passionate about something because it might lead you down the wrong path. So there's a degree of something to that. And so he brings up this guy, William Clifford. So this essay is to some extent a response essay to another essay that Clifford wrote called The Ethics of Belief, which I should put in the description because it is quite relevant to the kind of attitude that he would be arguing against here. And I would say that Clifford can be slightly analogized to some of like the new atheists today, someone like Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins. And the stuff that he says makes sense, but here's what he has to say. Belief is desecrated when given to the unproved and unquestioned statements for the solace and private pleasure of the believer. Whoso would deserve well of his fellows in this matter will guard the purity of his belief with a very fanaticism of jealous care, lest at any time it should rest on an unworthy object and catch a stain which can never be wiped away. If a belief has been accepted on insufficient evidence, even though the belief be true, as Clifford on the same page explains, that's James, the pleasure is a stolen one. It is sinful because it is stolen in defiance of our duty to mankind. That duty is to guard ourselves from such beliefs as from a pestilence, which may shortly master our own body and then spread to the rest of the town. It is wrong always, everywhere, and for everyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. So he is making a very strong case here. And the example that he uses in his essay, I believe it's in that essay, is let's say you're responsible for a ship and a journey across the Atlantic Ocean or something like that. And you don't take the time to make sure that the ship is a secure ship. But you still have the voyage anyway, because you say it'll be okay. It's not based on insufficient evidence. It's not based on sufficient evidence, but I just have faith that the voyage is going to work out. And then in the middle of the ocean, all these people drown and die because you didn't do your due diligence and check whether or not the ship was going to sink. Well, that makes sense to some degree, right? So he says it's in fact ethical for you to make sure that what you believe is a secure belief. And he's very much talking in the language. It very much reminds me of Jonathan Pajot and the idea of we have this city that we want to protect and we want to let in some information, some beliefs. And so Clifford is saying the test for what a good belief to let in is one that we have sufficient evidence for. We don't want to let in any potential risky dangers that could be the disease that makes the whole tower collapse. So he's very much thinking in this, that the body of knowledge is like a city, like a majestic city. And so we only want to let the purest pieces of evidence in, or else we're going to have some internal corruption and the whole thing is going to fall apart. Because if we have one of these weak beliefs come in and we try to build, a building on that foundation, it's going to collapse later and then people are going to die in the building. So there's legitimacy to that. You want to make sure that your beliefs are true. So then James gets into what makes something a dead hypothesis, right? So hypotheses are not just conjured out of thin air. We can't just make things up. They usually are part of some kind of tradition. So in most religious traditions appeal to some kind of text or a set of scholars or a set of prophets or an important figure like Jesus and what they've said, or saints, or the experience of the believers, or the church, or whatever you might want to call it. And so when a hypothesis is dead, it's usually made dead by a past act of the will. So they're actively killed somehow. So at some point we were discussing in some council, like, is this true or is this true? And then the elders at the time said, it's very important to make sure that people in the future don't consider this one. So we're going to have a public declaration that we believe this is not true, that we believe this is heresy or something like that. So the matrix of what hypotheses are alive to you is very much determined by where you grew up or where you came from. So most of the arguments that we hear are not what initially convinced us, but we use them to defend ourselves. So most of our beliefs are sort of like, they're just kind of what our makeup is, and then the arguments for those beliefs is not usually the source of the belief. It's just a shield. So in Ephesians 6, they talk about the armor of God, and the shield is the shield of faith, and its job is to defend you from the arrows of doubt, and that's how it's described. So the your body is built up of your beliefs of whatever ideas that you have, and the faith itself, the arguments somehow are help you and shield you against falsehood. In that's, now maybe those arrows are like saving arrows, I don't know, but to some degree that's what the arguments do. They're more a defense than they are the actual foundation itself. And then he starts to talk about other places that people have faith. So this is what he was talking about a little bit when he was saying earlier that the scientists at Harvard that he's talking to, they themselves have a kind of faith, even if they don't like to think of it as faith. They have a faith that, okay, every day that they come in and do their experiments, if you're talking about more like an experimental scientist, when they come in and do their experiments, they have a faith that there is, one, a truth out there, and two, that they can attain it. And that truth itself is taken on faith. The fact that there might be a law that's discoverable, that's true across time and space, that's taken on faith. This is very much like in Hume has the problem of induction. You can't see causality. You can't see that when this event happens and then this event happens right after it. You can't prove to me that when this pool ball hit this pool ball, that's what caused the second one to move, right? But you can but you kind of take on assumption that there is some sort of causality, that there is a uniformity in the world, and there is a faith, and that the science that you're building is actually based on something. So he's telling these scientists, you also have faith, you have a will to believe those things. And so a skeptic, so Hume kind of experiments with radical skepticism, that skeptics simply lack the will to believe. So it's a question of willpower, not so much simply like, are they more rational, or are they more scrutinizing, or do they not understand your specific argument, like a Cartesian, how he escapes from the box of his own mind kind of thing. So, and he mentions so these scientists, they don't even consider beliefs that they don't have use for. And James was very different than other scientists. Like these scientists, like he said, the example he uses, they won't investigate telepathy because it would mess with their assumptions about how the universe works. It would mess with their assumptions of how there's uniform laws and that things can only cause each other across space. So if I can go like this and then a car explodes over there, that would destroy all their scientific theories. So they don't want to let that one in, simply because they want to protect the theories that they already have. So James would go to like seances, and he was very interested in like ghosts and like these weird psychic powers. You can kind of see that from the fact that he does all this stuff in varieties of religious experience as well. So he was a very unorthodox kind of guy, but that's how he was. But then he kind of he goes, this is his thesis for the essay. Our passional nature not only lawfully may, but must decide an option between propositions whenever it is a genuine option that cannot by its nature be decided on intellectual grounds. For to say, under such circumstances, do not decide, but leave the question open, is itself a passional decision, just like deciding yes or no, and is attended with the same risk of losing the truth. So these scientists that say, oh, well, you can't make a choice there just because you think this way is better, just because you want, just because you have passion, you should suppress the passion and let objective data come in and solve the questions for you. And James is saying, well, one, sometimes this is not an option for people to wait for the data to come in. It's just simply not an option. And in fact, you telling them that they can't make a choice based on those margins is actually another way of losing truth, because you're sending away prophets that might tell you about a coming greater threat or something like that. That's a way you can think about it. So now he starts to, that's kind of like an apex of the essay, and then he's going to start to show some other things that are going to enlighten what else he's trying to talk about and get towards what he's talking about later in the essay. So at this point, we're past skepticism, he says. We'll all agree that we have some kind of faith that there is a truth and that it is by some means yet unknown attainable. So these are the two proposed means. This is like two major schools in philosophy, absolutism and empiricism. So the absolutists say we can know truths, one, and we can know when we know them. So somehow I have a set of propositions, first principles in my head that when I have them, then they show me what the next step is. This is very much like Descartes. This is maybe more like Plato or something like that. So we can know truths and we can know when we know them. We have some kind of extra rational divine sense that can like tell us exactly when something's happening. He describes it as kind of like a ding, like when you know something and you know that you know it, you get another extra ding. And then empiricists, on the other hand, agree we can know truth, so they're not skeptics, but we can't know exactly precisely when we know them. We can maybe assume that we've got sort of a partial grasp on the truth, but we can't say that we know all of it yet. And this is what James obviously prefers. The absolutists maybe are more on the side of philosophers, system builders, and empiricists would be more allied with experimental science or something like that. So, but they both have their own different dogmas of we can know and we can know when we know it, or we can know and we can't know when we know it. And so then he starts to criticize the objective evidence doctrine, which was a doctrine of the scholastic school in philosophy that would be more people like Thomas Aquinas. So that their doctrine was that you have objective evidence of something and you have this sensation, which is where the truth, whatever it is going to illuminate your intellect irresistibly. So you know when you know something because it's irresistibly illuminated, your intellect. And then between your intellect and whatever you're knowing, there's some kind of relationship of conformity and understanding, and everything, all the pieces fit together, and you've got this peace of mind sensation. So that's kind of describing the absolutist mindset of, oh, we've reached this point where we've finally, the truth is revealed to us. It's almost like a spiritual experience to some extent. And modern empiricists didn't think of themselves like this. They thought it was quite ugly. I'm going to read a little section here also that James has. Of some things, we feel that we are certain. We know and we know that we do know. There is something that gives a click inside of us, a bell that strikes 12, when the hands of our mental clock have swept the dial and meet over the meridian hour. The greatest empiricists among us are the only empiricists on reflection. When left to their instincts, they dogmatize like infallible popes. When the Cliffords tell us how sinful it is to be Christians on such insufficient evidence, insufficiency is really the last thing they have in mind. For them, the evidence is absolutely sufficient, only it makes the other way. They believe so completely in an anti-Christian order of the universe that there is no living option. Christianity is a dead hypothesis from the start. So he's saying, yes, empiricists, you don't think of yourselves like absolutists, but actually you are some of the strongest absolutists when it comes to specific questions. When it comes to specific questions like, can we know that there's a God? And then they say, no, we cannot know because we don't have evidence. So it would be sinful. They have a sense of it being sinful to believe in things based on evidence, just as much as the scholastics had an idea that usury was sinful or something like that. So he says this objective certitude thing, of course, it's a nice ideal from the scholastic perspective and the empiricist perspective, but where is it? You know, the whole fact that the whole history of philosophy, he says, shows us that all these moments where people are so certain that all the truth has been shown to them, usually they end up falling flat in their face like 25 years later, where someone else has the opposite belief and believes it just as strongly. So we want to sort through these tests of certitude, and he goes, no final test has ever been decided on. No, there's things like the inconceivability of the opposite. Well, turns out 55 years later, somebody conceives of the opposite, and then the whole thing falls flat in its face. So these things, they seem very secure, but they may not be, because they might congeal in one person's head very clearly, and the fact that they can't understand or they can't sympathize with someone that might think the other way makes them feel so certain. So he's really just kind of pushing against a too strong understanding of human certainty and how dangerous it is to think that you're certain. Specifically, he says the most striking application of the doctrine of objective certitude is the Inquisition. When you're so absolutely certain that your set of beliefs is true, you might do these things that destroy the very evidence that would be the counterpoint, right? So if you have an index of forbidden books, maybe it turns out that your objective certitude will be shifted if you were to read those books, right? So he doesn't want to claim, he doesn't want to be a skeptic and say we can never know these things because we can't know everything, but he does want to say, don't be so certain that what you believe is true to the extent that you damage what might have improved what you believe. So there's a parable that Jesus tells in the book of Matthew, the parable of the tares. And so it's just a master plants a field of grain, right? And then in the nighttime, the enemy comes in and plants tares, which is like a kind of weed. So when the morning comes, the servants of the master say, should we go around and take up all of the tares? And the master says, no, don't do that, because you might accidentally pull up some of the wheat along with it. So we'll wait until harvest day, and then we'll know what is wheat and what is a tare. So it's very much like Jesus is saying in this parable, there is truth and falsehood, and there's a way that we can kind of understand rough around the edges here. But the simple fact that you don't know with 100% certainty means that you shouldn't just go around cutting down things you think are wrong, because you might cut down something that will provide good fruit later. And there are final tests. So in Christianity, in that sense, the final judgment is the only test of certitude. That's the hope, is that in the future, Jesus will come down and sort the wheat from the chaff. So this is when I think he really gets technically down to what's a really great part of the essay. So when you're inquiring, you're trying to do two things at the same time. When you're doing intellectual exercises, you're doing two things. You think of it as one thing, but he says, usually people think of it as just the first one, the desire to obtain the truth. Oh, I'm searching for things because I want to know the truth. Well, you can want to know the truth, and at the same time, you kind of have a different motivation. You want to avoid errors. All these different thoughts, hypotheses can fit in your head. Some of them are true, some of them are false. So you want to keep the true ones and push out the bad ones, right? So he says, okay, well, you can sort these two desires in two different ways. If you desire to obtain truth more than you desire to avoid errors, then you could just stick everything in your head, right? Just start believing everything, I guess, except for contradictions, which are impossible to believe at the same time. So you can do that, but then you'll end up with a bunch of errors in your head. Then you have a big problem, right? Or you can do it the other way. You can say, I care more about avoiding errors than I care about obtaining the truth. So I'm going to just not let anything in, because everything might be an error. I don't know with 100% certainty what is an error, what isn't the truth, but then you fall flat in your face again because you have no truth. You have nothing to build on. So that's what he says is the problem with Clifford. Is he just it's interesting, I thought, that he makes it a social thing here. Out of a desire not to look like a dupe, Clifford puts B over A. He cares so much about avoiding errors that he doesn't want to will risking believing something in order to obtain the truth. And so James says some of these things are unavoidable risks. If an option is not genuine, for example, we might not need to face it. If it's avoidable or if it's trivial, we can just say, like, yeah, I don't know, and then like move on. And then we can wait, and then like we get objective evidence. Somebody comes out with a paper in like 5 years, and then we go like, okay, well, that's good. So think about the virus right now, which is going on. The virus, all the questions the governments are making are genuine options, right? Because they're forced, they need to do something. They need to either have restrictions or not. They need to either open up the economy or close the economy. And whichever one they do, it's going to be momentous, because on one side, it's going to damage the economy a lot. On one side, it might cause a lot of death because of the virus. But, like both of them are conceivable options to do something like that. Now, I was actually thinking about it a little bit. The current governments and the choices they're facing are genuine options, whereas perhaps in 1918, previous pandemics, full shutdowns were not as conceivable and might not be considered living options. So this might be the first genuine option to shut down the economy in some sense. So, but other issues like oh, what are we going to do? Are we going to like increase like, EPA funding by like whatever percent or decrease it or whatever? This is not like as pressing, right? But somebody says, oh, well, climate change, so it is pressing, so maybe it is. See, even whether or not something is forced or avoidable, or whether or not it's momentous or trivial, is those are also like part of the debate. So, but when there is no forced decision, when we can let something go, then maybe dispassionate thinking is best. Maybe we just wait for the evidence to come in, whether or not it comes in. If it's a trivial thing, then we can risk not having an opinion. And this is a very interesting part that I've read this essay maybe 3-4 times, and I don't think I really understood this until the last couple times, that faith is part of the process of its own verification. So what does he mean by that? Well, remember, faith is in some hypothesis, it's in some belief, and to James, again, a belief is a rule for action, or it's a habit for action. So in some sense, if you do not hold that belief and then live out that action, for some reason, you might never know whether or not it's true. So you have to have enough faith to believe something to even confirm its truth. So he says this is what happens in science. That's what science is, a normal scientific hypothesis. It's a scientist is kind of looking at some other paper, looking at something, and they go, I have a hunch that this might be true. And you have to, that hypothesis motivates the belief that it is worth searching for this potential answer. So every scientist has a miniature, it's not as all-encompassing and life-changing as a religious faith per se, but every single hypothesis is a miniature faith. It's a miniature dogma that's being proposed and then experimented upon. So belief on desire is permissible. That's every scientist desires to engage in their experimentation. So if a scientist was truly dispassionate, they couldn't prove to themselves that what they were doing was worthwhile. So I don't know why they would do it. And they have a desire for the truth, and they have a desire to avoid error. At root, all of these actions are based on desire. That's the language that we have for them. So yeah, and so belief on desire is permissible and perhaps indispensable, especially to reach certain heights. So now James starts to get into actually what's unique about his talk with regards to religion itself. So when we say that we have faith in something religious, as opposed to this like kind of scientific faith he's been talking about, or faith in basic actions of life, what's important about religion, and what does it mean for something to be a religious sentiment? And now I know that you can turn the word religion very broadly and just mean it, any kind of commitment in your life. And James notices this, and he recognizes that in the varieties of religious experience. But he says that he wants to kind of shrink the word to mean more specific things. So he says, as broadly as he can tell, what's common between many different religions is that the best things are the more eternal things. This is what Vanderklay says when he says that the religion is about the always and politics is about the now. Well, James actually says that the now and the always have to be related in some way, and that's what's very tricky. Not that Vanderklay would disagree. That's actually the point that he's making, right? So the best things are the more eternal things, but it's not just like a plane. Like if you can think of us like small villagers or something like that, and there's an airplane flying ahead, right? And we go like, wow, look at that. That's way better than us. That's way more incredible than us. It's like eternally circling the earth, like the moon or something like that. And then we'd go, yeah, like that's way better than us. But the second part of religion is that it actually has practical relevance now. So in some way, that plane, we can hope for that plane to come and like drop like supplies for us or something like that. Or maybe if we let up smoke signals, then the plane will drop food for us or something like that. And so if you think about like the great chain of being, not only is the top the best part, but there is some kind of chain between us and the top. So it's not just an abstract, oh yeah, that thing is better. It's actually that thing is better and is related to what we're doing in our finite lives in some way. And I think this is a big part in Kierkegaard and in Fear and Trembling and the different, when he talks about infinite and finite and the relationship between those things. I think that's very related in there as well. So Some people have faith as a living option, and for them, it's absolutely forced and momentous, and it's a genuine option. So he says religion in this realm is somewhere that people can have faith. Everything that he's been talking about with regards to having beliefs based on your passions, or having beliefs based on a forward-looking faith, he says this is totally relevant in religion, obviously. And so the skepticism that someone might have is, yeah, it's like in Pascal, it's like risk management, right? I might not want to believe in something because it might accidentally be something that's false, but sometimes you've got to take risks. We all know that. And this is the phrase that really, I think, is the clincher of the entire essay. He goes, a rule of thinking which would absolutely prevent me from acknowledging certain kinds of truth, if those kinds of truth were really there, would be an irrational rule. So if we think back, this is his slam dunk on Clifford. If we really think that you have to have 100% certainty evidence that your ship is a secure ship to go across the Atlantic, then you might not be able to make these trips across the Atlantic, and you'll collapse. So it might be a real truth that this is a safe, good ship with a good mission, but if you hold some kind of rule that prevents you from going on that trip, then it's an irrational rule. Now, it is good, of course, to have some kind of limited safety rule, make sure your ship is working. But if it's an 100% certainty rule, you're going to fail. And this is what a lot of now I'm getting into econ. This is what a lot of government regulations are. Is they're way too heavy on safety, to the extent that they prevent, like in the FDA, it's so heavy on the safety of a drug, and then it goes through this process in this specific way with these specific bureaucrats, and that the safety of the drug is made so certain on these terms that you end up preventing the drug from going out to market and actually helping people. And we saw this with the virus pandemic, actually, with the testing. The CDC and the FDA said, oh, well, we got to use this specific test, and it has to be tested in our way. And they said, we can't, they kind of lacked faith in their test, in a sense, and it hurt people. So there is real consequences to not having faith. And this can be played out in religion. It can be played out in practical things like dealing with a pandemic. So this is a phrase that Peterson uses when he talks about people who criticize faith. So when someone like Richard Dawkins will criticize somebody having faith, Peterson says, well, the faith that I care about, this is not the faith that a smart 13-year-old boy would object to. So you go, well, yeah, I know that like God isn't real or whatever, but you just believe in him, you have faith. It's just like it's almost like an asking someone to act in a way that they feel silly because that's what you're supposed to do, or something like that. No, if you want to actually convince someone to have faith, you have to demonstrate to them what it would mean to follow that faith and what the practical fruits of that faith are. It's not like you're enticing them or saying like, oh, if you believe what I believe, then you can get a little prize. But it's actually trying to get them to believe it on their own terms. You don't just say, oh, well, this is what it means to have faith. That's the sentiment of a Bible thumper. That's not the same kind of faith. That's almost pure tenacity. If I ever do another series on some things in Peirce, I need to do a lot of more reading in Peirce myself. But he has a great essay called The Fixation of Belief. And one of the methods to fix your belief is tenacity, pure willpower. All potential anomalies to your system, you just shove them out. So there's a way of having religious faith, which is anytime that something is presented that might challenge what you believe, you just tell it that it doesn't exist. Whereas it might be telling you to improve yourself or understand or come into better relationship with things. But he says also the idea that we should wait for 100% certainty in evidence is the idol of philosophers, and it's the idol of scientists. It's the idol of certainty, and it's something that you should not be putting your sacrifices in front of. So to this extent, we have to respect each other's mental rights, he calls them. He says later on that he somewhat regretted the title of the essay, and he says he wanted to call it The Right to Believe. So take that as you will, if that changes anything for you. But about what you're understanding, what he's trying to communicate here. But at the very least, what we want to do is, if you have faith, I shouldn't just say, well, there's no reason for him to have faith, and give myself the liberty to cut down what he's doing. You have to respect the other person's mental rights. And he says in the most important transactions in life, we take a leap in the dark. So the most momentous decisions, the most important choices, and the ones that we're forced to make, these are often taken on faith. So understanding what it means to make a faith-based decision is not something that's worthy of study. And that's actually what most religious traditions are doing, is they're giving someone kind of a landing pad for when they make the leap of faith. And they're giving people a little bit more security to take leaps of faith. So if you see all these people around you that have taken the leap and they're on the other side and they're still around, it gives you a little bit more security to make that leap yourself. And he ends with this phrase: "Be strong and of good courage. Act for the best. Hope for the best, and take what comes. If death ends all, we cannot meet death better." So he says, he's almost talking in terms of Clifford's thing. He goes, if you live your whole life and you didn't let any ships cross the ocean because you were so scared that they were going to sink, then you'll look back on your life like you failed in some degree. Whereas, yeah, maybe you failed because you didn't check if it's secure enough, but if you a lot of people regret not taking risks in their life. And now that doesn't mean sometimes they shouldn't have regretted it. Sometimes it's good to not take risks. I don't like taking risks, but they're an important and part of a rich, full life. So next lecture, we're going to be talking about, is life worth living? So you can finally know the answer to that question. But yeah, I hope this was beneficial, or it made any sense. I'm not exactly 100% confident about the style, but so let me know if anyone has any criticisms, other ideas. Thank you. Goodbye.